Good morning. I don't even know if it's right to call me a speaker this morning because I'm going to be very, very brief. And you're going to hear from some of the really premier experts in this entire field. And I have the privilege to introduce one of them. But first of all, I just wanted to say that one of the things that's special about the greater Cleveland area is that if you look at how passionate people are in this county about children's issues, I think it compares to any other city in the country. And if there's any doubt about that, you can just look at the participation that we have this morning in this conference. So I especially just wanted to thank you for being here. And I also wanted to thank, if we just recognize Janet and her staff for helping to put this whole thing together. It's really incredible. Whenever I hear about these issues, one of the reasons I wanted to be here was I just want to tell you a little bit about my philosophy. The county government, the new county government, according to the charter that we operate under that was passed in 2009, it says specifically that the county is supposed to make as its primary focus economic development. And there's a lot that's been in the news about the way the county is trying to promote economic development. And economic development is certainly important. And there are signs that our economy is starting to rebound, and that's great, and that's a good thing. But what we don't want is an economic recovery that just kind of passes over like a wave the various social problems and human services challenges that we have. So as important as economic development is, human services, the human factor in the kind of society we have is just as important to county government as anything else, which is why I wanted to be here. I had a brief experience in my life for a couple years where I worked in juvenile court, first as a guardian ad litem and then as a juvenile court prosecutor. And I walked out of juvenile court sometime in the 90s and swore that I would never return. It is a difficult environment to work in. Those of you that work in this field have my absolute respect, and I also had the advantage of having two parents that were both in the public health field that both worked with children's issues their entire life, and I heard their stories all my life growing up. I can't hear about this topic without thinking about some of the things that I saw as a prosecutor, where I saw and I had to try to prepare children to testify in criminal cases who had seen things and experienced things that I never had, and I just can't imagine how they dealt with it. And I still wonder about that. And then I later went on to try a lot of other cases, do a lot of other things, but those are some of my strongest memories. And I've always wondered how does a child how do they deal with that? How do they factor that in? How does that affect them? And I don't know the answer to that, but I know that we have to search for the answer for that. And the county is going to do everything possible to try to make sure that the trajectory of that child's life is not defined by that event. So that's why I'm very proud to be supportive of all the work that Janet does, and that I was happy to be invited to speak here. It's my privilege now at this time to introduce the first speaker that you're going to hear from this morning. And again, I just want to say, if you go through the speakers that you have, they're really some of the premier people in the country on this issue, and we're so pleased to have them here in Cleveland. Dr. Benjamin Saunders is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, South Carolina, and Associate Director of the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center. He received his PhD in clinical social work from Florida State University in 1982, his master's degree in family therapy from Virginia Tech in 1979, and a BA in religious studies from the University of South Florida in 1977. His research has been funded by multiple agencies, and in 2001, he received the Research Career Achievement Award from the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Saunders.
Well, first of all, thanks. This is such an incredible privilege to be here. And in the short time I've been here, I've met some folks and heard about the work that you guys are doing here in Cleveland and in the, really in the whole northern Ohio area. And it is exciting, and I would agree with your county executive that the work that is going on here is in fact world-class, and the rest of the country can really learn from a lot of the work that's being done in here in Cleveland. As a matter of fact, I've already learned some things this morning talking to some of your people, and heard about some ideas that we will be taking back to South Carolina. So first of all, let me just say it's a pleasure to be here and commend you for the work that you're doing, and I hope that we can talk a little bit this morning that will give you some information that maybe will even help you to improve what's already going on. You know, when we were talking about what this might be this morning, it at first seemed to me to be a self-evident type of topic, the notion of violence and victimization of kids, and kind of, is that a bad thing? I think we can all stipulate that it's a bad thing, and that nobody in here is going to disagree with that. And most of us, when we get right down to it, when we think about abuse, victimization, exposure to violence, and other types of things that children might experience, most of us would view this as universally resulting in bad outcomes for kids. And when I first got in the field, which unfortunately I left those dates in that biography there, I actually attended school when I started at 13, and I got to take those dates out of there is what I got to do. When I first got into the field, which really I saw my first sexual abuse family in clinical treatment in 1979. And it's fair to say that in 1979 we knew virtually nothing about from a scientific standpoint, about the impact of child sexual abuse, the impact of other forms of victimization, exposure to violence, and this sort of thing, compared to what we know now. But one thing that has sort of not changed, I think, is a universal belief in the field, is that kids are victimized in many different ways. Kids are exposed to violence. Kids are exposed to abuse in many different ways. And this is 100% universally bad. All kids suffer serious difficulties and problems. And this is the common belief that we have in our field. One of the biggest challenges that we have in our field is to examine some of our time-honored notions, is to examine some of the beliefs that have grown up as the lore of our field, the narrative of our field, and begin to apply some of the enormous science that has been done in our field, particularly over the past 20 years, to those particular beliefs, and then figure out how they might change the way we conduct our services. So this is one of them. Abuse is bad. It produces universally bad outcomes, and it's something that I think probably not many of us in here would disagree with. Of course, from a scientific standpoint, this raises the question, is that really true? Is it really true that victimization, is it really true that exposure to violence, child abuse, whatever traumatic event you want to talk about, that it is universally bad, always causes bad things, kids are always crippled, kids are always going to need some type of major intervention after such an event occurs or set of events occurs, or they live a life in that particular way, and that we need to develop universal services for every child that's ever been victimized in that way. This becomes, if that is true, then this becomes an enormous community challenge. And we'll find out why in just a minute. So let's take a look at this particular question. Is, in fact, exposure to violence really a serious risk factor? And more importantly, does it always, in every case, result in crippling dysfunction among children? We have done a whole series of studies over the years, large-scale, nationally representative epidemiological studies in which we've gotten large samples, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 kids, nationally representative of the U.S. of children living in households in the United States. These have collectively been called the National Surveys of Adolescence, and there's, if you have trouble reading it, sleeping at night, you can get some of the many scientific publications, read those, and I can guarantee you that you will fall asleep immediately. But we can pull some of this data out of here and apply it to this particular question. What do we know about this? Well, first of all, one thing that we do know is that victimization and violence is in fact pervasive among children and adolescents. I don't know, I don't think I have a little pointer here. I don't know, do I? Nobody knows. Okay, I'll point like this. This is the data from our original NSA. This was a nationally representative sample of 4,023 kids between the ages of 12 and 17. And we asked these kids about different types of victimization. We did very careful screening of these adolescents, and we asked them about their experiences with sexual assault, physical assault in the community, physically abusive, severe physically abusive punishment by a parent, and witnessing violence within the home or in the community. And what we found in these particular data was that nearly half, 1 out of 2 adolescents, American adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17, had experienced at least one of these. These are only 5 types of victimization that we ask about. You can think of others that they may have experienced. And of those 5 types that we ask about, half of the kids in the nation had experienced at least one of those. Now think about that. You can see over on the right that this particular study was done in 1995, and we replicated it in 2005, found pretty much exactly the same type of data. 22 million adolescents in the nation, half of them have experienced a serious violence or victimization event. Think about the Cleveland area. Urban areas tend to have higher levels of exposure to violence. So my guess is that in the Cleveland area, it's even higher here. Are we going to develop services that will be able to serve 70% of the children in an adequate way in the Cleveland area who have been exposed to violence? That becomes a pretty significant challenge. I don't know how many, I don't know what the population of Cleveland is. I don't know how many adolescents you have in this town, but do the math. Start thinking about serving all of those kids. It becomes a daunting challenge. This suggests that there may be children that we simply can't serve. There may be children that because of the numbers, we simply can't do what we need to do. How do we, as a community service system, deal with that particular issue? Well, let's find out. One thing we also found out in this particular study, and of course this is clear as a bell, I'm sure everybody gets this immediately, but we asked kids, we looked at the kids in terms of whether or not they had ever met diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, a very severe mental disorder related to trauma. And you'll notice a pattern here. Of the kids that experienced sexual assault, approximately a third of them had developed PTSD as a result. Of the kids that had not experienced a sexual assault, it was 5 to 7%, depending on if male or female. Physical assault, if they experienced a physical assault, much more likely to experience PTSD than if they had not experienced a physical assault. Same thing with witnessing violence, much more likely to experience PTSD. Well, what this tells us is, obviously, that exposure to violence is, in fact, a risk factor. You're dramatically more likely, in the case of sexual assault, about 5 times more likely to develop PTSD if you're a child, if you've experienced a sexual assault compared to if you have not. That's the element of a risk factor. There's an increased likelihood that you're going to experience that particular outcome. That's what these data tell us. Most of research is finding out things that we already know. This is not shocking, call Mike Wallace news. We currently already know that, right? It just attaches numbers to what we're talking about. Notice one thing, though. How many kids, even sexual assault, which in virtually all of our victimization research, we find that sexual assault is the most toxic types of victimization that you can have. Even in sexual assault, 2/3 of the kids, guess what? Did not develop PTSD. A third did, but 2/3 did not. They're dramatically more likely to develop it, but they are not doomed to develop it. What about substance abuse? Guess what? Very similar type of pattern, more victimization, more substance abuse. Not a big shock to you guys, my guess is. What about delinquency? Same thing. guess what? More victimization, the more likely that you're going to engage in delinquent acts. But notice, even with delinquency and even with substance abuse and delinquency, you can see for males is quite high for sexually assaulted males. But even with the most dramatic type of difference that we see with sexually assaulted males, half of those kids do not engage in delinquent acts. They're dramatically more likely to, but many don't. Another thing that we find is that it's the number, it's the cumulative effect of victimization. That is the thing that leads to very high rates of mental disorder. So we can see kids that experienced, here on the far left, kids that experienced no victimization. The 50% of kids in the U.S. that experienced no victimization had extremely low levels of these negative outcomes, whether they be substance abuse, delinquency, whatever. If they experience 1, it goes up. If they experience 2, it goes really up. If they experience 3 different types of victimization, it goes really, really, really up. So it is not a single occurrence that really is the thing that we pay attention to. It's these multiple victimizations that kids experience over time. Those are the things that, for most children, lead to very dramatic negative outcomes on their part. So we're starting to get some clues. We're starting to get some clues about the kids that may really need our services. In fact, there may be kids that get victimized that literally don't need our services. That's hard for us to wrap our heads around as a service system. Most of us come into this field wanting to help every child that had every bad thing ever happen to us. Then we get extraordinarily frustrated because guess what? Money, time, effort, number of people, service agencies available don't allow you to do that. So we get burnt out. We walk away and we say, there's nothing I can do about this. This tells us that some of these data begin to tell us there may be kids that desperately need our help. At the same time, there may be kids that don't need our help. There may be kids that experience very serious victimizations that, in fact, are going to do just fine without people like us. That's something that most of us, that's a new thought. That's a new idea in terms of service delivery. So if you're interested at all in some of these data, you can download this off of the Justice Department website. This summarizes a lot of the stuff, and I think it's actually going to be on a website related to this particular conference if you're interested in seeing some of these data from the national survey. So what do we mean by a risk factor? Well, a risk factor is simply a characteristic that is possessed by a person or a situation that increases the likelihood of an outcome occurring. So in these cases, we've just seen depictions of risk factors. When victimization occurs, they're more likely to get it. However, there's a couple things you got to remember about risk factors. Number one, not everyone with the characteristic is going to have the outcome. And we just saw that. Not everyone that is victimized, not every kid that is victimized is going to have those negative outcomes. Some are going to be more likely than others. Number two, not everyone with the outcome will have the characteristic. Just because you have PTSD doesn't mean that you were sexually assaulted. It doesn't mean you were victimized. You can get PTSD or depression or substance abuse for other reasons in addition to victimization. And number three, the characteristic actually may have nothing to do from a causative standpoint as to why you develop that. As one of my supervisors used to say, you can have ticks and fleas. And there may be situations where you think the ticks are causing it, but it really may be the fleas. So we got to pay attention to that when we start thinking about risk factors and looking at victimization. We tend to attribute virtually every negative thing that ever happens to a child to their history of victimization. Because why do I do that? Because I'm a victimization person. Guess what? If I was in another field, I would probably be attributing it to something else. So just because things are related doesn't necessarily mean that they are causative. So this tells us that there are some responses to trauma that we as a field in the 21st century, since we have the data available, we're not operating the way Saunders had to operate in 1979. We have the data available. We need to use the data to plan our services to make them more effective for the kids that need them. And one of these aspects is understanding what the responses to trauma might be. And one response that we really don't think about that much is the notion of resilience. Believe it or not, there are kids that can experience extremely serious forms of victimization, and through their own natural coping ability, the support of their family and friends, the support of their school, the support of just their own general makeup, they are able to cope with this. The data seem to suggest that this is actually the majority of kids. The majority of kids don't walk into our offices. The majority of kids don't come to our offices and knock on my door. I've been in practice for 31 years. I've never had a child knock on my door and say, Dr. Saunders, I need some psychotherapy. I know that's stunning to figure out, but it's stunning to me. I can't imagine why nobody would want that. But they don't. There are kids, most kids, and in fact, most victims deal with it on their own, and luckily, most deal with it successfully. This would be the notion of resilience. On the other hand, we have the notion of natural recovery. There are kids that have bad things happen. They do develop problems, but there is a natural recovery process that, in fact, does not involve professional intervention. That kids, through, again, their own natural coping abilities, their own ability to seek out help from friends and family and people that are actually going to be in their life for a long time, that they are able to recover from this. And this characterizes quite a large proportion of most victims. But then we have these folks. We have these folks in which bad things happen, the child develops problems, and in fact, some type of professional intervention is needed. And these are the kids that really need what you do. These are the kids that desperately need our help, and they are not going to get better. These are the kids that really need to come to us. So when we think about trauma response pathways, we have the kids in which abuse occurs or violence exposure occurs, and they're going to, frankly, manage it without us. We are not necessary to their lives. But then we have the kids that are going to develop problems, some of which are going to naturally recover over time. But then we have these kids that are going to, where intervention is required, and unfortunately, some of those kids are going to get better, and some of those kids are not going to get better. This suggests that the intervention that we use is critical. What are the interventions that we can use that will minimize that persistence bubble over there, minimize the kids that persistently have symptoms over time, no matter what we do, and maximize the number of kids where those symptoms resolve and they go on and live functional lives? What are the interventions we can use that will make that balance something that we can work with? So, how do we explain all those little arrows on those diagrams? What are the things that explain all those little arrows? Well, this explains it. Clear as a bell, right? Okay, well, my work is done, so we'll move on. This is actually a little chart. This comes from another study we did called the National Women's Study. This was a large nationally representative sample of adult women in which we looked at what were the predictors of post-traumatic stress disorder, or some of the predictors of their development of post-traumatic stress disorder. So on your far left over here, we find that these incident characteristics, that it turns out that what happened to the women, you can characterize certain aspects of what happened to them, and if they have more of these characteristics, they tend to have a much greater likelihood of developing PTSD. So, if they were raped, meaning that some type of penetration, sexual penetration actually occurred, their likelihood of developing PTSD goes up. If the assault that they experienced was a series assault, meaning that they had a similar type of experience over and over and over again by the same offender. The prototypical thing is an incest case where dad is repeatedly sexually assaulting the child over a 2-year period. If it was a series assault. If physical force was used, to make the victimization happen, then that increases the likelihood. If life threat, if the person believed that they would be killed or seriously injured during any of the assaults, their likelihood of sexual assault goes up, their likelihood of PTSD goes up. If they experienced a physical injury during the assault, the likelihood goes up. And there are other of these, but under the PTSD column, you can see that if people have absolutely none of those characteristics, there's about a 10% likelihood that they're going to develop PTSD. If they have all of those characteristics, there's about a 2/3 likelihood that they're going to get PTSD. Again, we start getting some clues about who might really need our services. Are we going to use valuable, very short community resources with folks that have about a 10% chance of a negative outcome versus folks that have about a 2/3 chance of a negative outcome? Now, we would love to have universal services for everybody, right? Is that possible? Well, it may be in Cleveland. I can tell you in Charleston, South Carolina, it's not. So these are, again, some things that begin to give us a few clues about how we might begin to use the data to plan our services. This is really clear, I'm sure. The reason I put this up is this is the model, the theoretical model we use in terms of understanding characteristics that lead to negative outcomes in our national surveys of adolescents. Do you get the sense that it's kind of complicated? Remember when we started out with abuse, bad. Folks, it's the 21st century. It's the 21st century. I'm not saying abuse is good. Please, for God's sakes, don't go out of here and say, Saunders said abuse is good. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is more complicated than that. And we need to have more sophisticated services that take into account issues such as this. So, is exposure a risk factor? The answer is yes, but more complicated than that. More complicated than that. Can we develop a service system? Can we develop a service system in professional practice that takes into account the complexity of what we now know about childhood victimization? That's our challenge. In my view, that's our challenge in the next 2 decades in our field. You know, if we stick with the same sort of advocacy model that we had for the past 30 years, where we say, if anything, if the least little bad thing happens to any child, they need to have a whole systems of care set of services dumped on top of them. Guess what? We're not going to get very far. We can't afford it. There's not enough time, there's not enough people, there's not enough money. However, can we develop more sophisticated level-based services or more sophisticated ways of understanding who is very likely to need our services and doing an excellent job with them, at the same time providing perhaps lower-level services for folks that are less likely to need it? I don't know what the answer is. Good news is that's up to you guys. I can just tell you what the phenomena looks like. So what do we want? We want effective services, right? We want effective services that can help with some of these negative outcomes that we know are related to kids and related to victimization among kids. And so we want those services that will be effective. We have limited resources, limited people, limited space, limited everything. We want those treatments that are going to be effective. Problem. All sorts of treatments are out there, right? We got all sorts of programs. Everybody and their brother's got a program. Everybody and their brother's got a brochure. Everybody and their brother's got a website. How many people would send their clients to see Bruce? Raise your hand. I see no hands raised. I see no hands raised. Why not? Okay, we got one smartass up here. We won't say who he is. Why would you not send your clients to Bruce? Any idea? This is the audience participation part, I guess. It's a little big for that, I guess, but. End up with another problem. Well, how do we know that Bruce's stress management clinic doesn't have good outcomes? How do we know that Bruce's stress management clinic doesn't have at least as good outcomes as your program?
Alcohol is the central nervous system depressant, and it's going to make it worse in the long run.
Okay, there's somebody up here that has a radical idea that giving kids alcohol might not be that great a thing. But how do we know? How do we know that Bruce's stress management clinic does not have at least as good and perhaps better outcomes for the kids that he sees that have been victimized than your place? Yes, ma'am. Do we know our outcomes? Do we know our outcomes? We'll talk about that in just a second. Keep that in mind. Keep Bruce in mind. Question. How do we sort out the good things from the bad things? How do we sort out the Bruces from, of course, our excellent program, right? Right? How do we know that Bruce? Of course I'm better than Bruce. How do I know? Because I am. I got a website. I got a brochure. I saw 400 kids last year. Of course I'm better. We'll find out. How do we sort this out from the snake oil that might be out there for us? Here's some common errors we make when we try to sort it out. Number one, we rely solely on individual anecdotes and remembered cases. Well, you know, I was working with Billy last week, and Billy had a hard life. You know, he's doing great now. He's going to college next year. We all have those stories in our brochures, right? You know what? Bruce has a good story, too. He probably has good people that, you know, came to his clinic, and now they went to college. We rely on those anecdotes. We rely on those remembered cases, the kids that we know got better as a result of what we did. Problem is, we may not be remembering the other kids that didn't get better. We may not be remembering the other, and the reason those kids got better may not have anything to do with our program. You know, we confuse client satisfaction with improvement. Boy, this kid, he really likes coming to our program. He really likes his therapist. You can't keep him away. You know, this was an actual quote from one of our community staffings. The family just loved coming to see me, never missed a session during their 3 years of therapy. Amazing. Too bad they had to move away. The only reason this kid stopped therapy was she moved. It wasn't because she got better. This child, I know this child started therapy at age 3. She was 6 when she moved away. This kid spent half of her life in therapy, never got better. Yet, she loved coming to therapy. And we would define that, my program's great. Client satisfaction is not clinical outcome. Now, we like it when our clients love to come, but there are situations when our clients are forced to come, and guess what? They get better. Just because they don't, the two may be related, but they're not indicative of each other. Assuming more is always better, or an untested something is better than nothing. When we develop service plans, treatment plans, case planning, whatever you guys call it up here, you know, there's always the more is better notion. Substance abuse, send them to the substance abuse program. Victimization, send them over to the Child Advocacy Center. You know, sexual assault, send them to the Rape Crisis Center. All of a sudden, we've got a service plan where if this person actually did it, they'd be going to therapy 7 days a week. And we now have data that demonstrates that there's a certain point where we get not only diminishing returns, but effective therapies don't work anymore because we pile on the services. This is part of being a sophisticated treatment program in the 25th century, is understanding that 1 or 2 effectively delivered interventions is going to be better than 7 or 8 poorly delivered. Understanding that. Well, we misattribute the cause of change, and this is an actual quote. The anger management class really seemed to work after he was arrested. You know what? I found out arrest smooths people out a little bit. It may not be the anger management class, you know? I've seen a lot of kids that when they get arrested, all of a sudden all that anger turns to fear, baby. And I'm not angry anymore. I'm scared to death. But my anger management class thinks they did a great job. Well, they may have done a great job, but it may not be the anger management class. Failure to appreciate resilience and natural recovery. We've kind of already talked about that. With treatment, the PTSD resolved in 3 months after the rape. Guess what the average length of time of natural recovery after a sexual assault is? 3 months. This is why I love being a mental health professional, because most of your people get better no matter what you do. Between natural recovery and the placebo effects, about 65% of people get better no matter what we do. It's great, because then I can say, I've got a 65% positive outcome rate. My program's great. Now, those third of people that don't get better, who knows? Guess what? Those are the folks that need effective therapy. So we need to appreciate that. We have this guru effect in our field, you know, where people, because people like Saunders or other folks who are reasonably entertaining when they get up in a group in front of you, everybody tends to believe whatever they say. You know, it's a long tradition in our field. And the fact of the matter is we now have data, we now have evaluation, we now have research that can guide us in this direction. We don't have to solely rely on the judgment of gurus in the field. We need to be relying on the data that's available to us at this. So these are some common types of problems that we have when am I supposed to stop, Janet, by the way? Anybody know? I'm just wondering. Somebody could let me know that. What do we mean? So, what should we be using? Well, I'm arguing that we should be using evidence-based interventions. What do we mean by an evidence-based intervention? An evidence-based intervention is one that has met a minimum threshold of research demonstrating its efficacy with the people that we're interested in and the problems that we're interested in. And my guess is that everybody's in here is familiar with this notion of evidence-supported interventions. Okay, great. We're obviously more convinced of the efficacy of an intervention the more high-quality research that is available to demonstrate its efficacy. The more it's able to be implemented in community service agencies and get good outcomes, you know. Now, the great news in our field, and I tell you, this really is unbelievably good news for us in our field. The great news in our field is that we have lots of these. There are lots of programs, lots of treatment protocols, lots of intervention protocols that have repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly demonstrate that if you do them and you do them properly, kids, even seriously disturbed kids, that 1/3 of kids that are going to have serious problems, even those kids will get better. This is the second huge challenge of our field for the next 2 decades, which is how do we actually use what we already know? How do we actually put into play in Cleveland, Ohio, what we have a extremely strong suspicion will actually work? How do we dispense with our narrative and our lore in the field, pay attention to the research, and implement it for the benefit of the children in our area? This is the huge challenge that we have. And why I am excited about being here is I've already heard how you guys are doing a lot of that already here in your town. And that's incredibly positive. But it is a challenge. It is a challenge to do this in a variety of ways. So why use ESTs? They work better. They work better. You'll be hard-pressed to find any serious research study that has found that they don't work better. This is just one review by one of the leaders in our field, John Weitz. Recently reviewed 32 randomized clinical trials for evidence-based treatments for youth, and he found that consistently evidence-based treatments outperform usual care. Now, if I told you, if your mama had cancer, if your daddy had heart problems, and I told you there was a treatment that would make them better, Or we could just do what we always do. Which one you want? Which one you want for your child, for your mother, for your daddy? Which one do you want? I don't know about you. I like my mom. I like my dad. I want the best for them. My kids, you never know. But we want the best, right? We want the best for our family members. We want the good stuff. We want the stuff that really works. We want the stuff that happens, that will make our family members, our friends, better. Well, guess what? The families that we work with are no different about their kids. They want the good stuff. How do you go to a mother whose son has been victimized, who now has a 50% chance of going into delinquency, now has a 1/3 chance of developing PTSD, has about a 40% chance, increased chance of developing substance abuse problems? How do you go to her and say, we're not going to give you what we know works? We're not going to do that. We're going to just do what we always do. How do you do that? This is the challenge of our field. How do we use what we know? How do we make it happen in our town for the benefit of our kids? It's not that we don't know at this point. When I was in my graduate program in Tallahassee, I worked at the Cairo Mental Health Center. Cairo, Georgia is in southwest Georgia. It's about as far off the edge of the earth as you can get. It's in the middle of absolute nowhere. And we had a storefront. That was the mental health center. Saunders was one of the therapists there. And one day the sheriff walked in and he said, and he had a family with him, his mom, dad, a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old. And the sheriff walked in, this was in 1979, the sheriff walked in and said Dad had been, quote, messing with the 15-year-old. Now, for those y'all unfamiliar, messing is a technical law enforcement term in South Georgia for sexual abuse. Continues to be used, by the way. The sheriff said, here you go, walked out the door, that was it. Dad never arrested. We didn't take him to the Child Advocacy Center because they didn't exist in 1979. We didn't do a forensic interview because we didn't know what forensic meant. And nothing happened other than it was turned over to the mental health system because it was a family problem. My boss, being a good administrator, turned to me and said, Saunders, this is your case. I said, thanks. I'd never worked with a sexual abuse case before. I didn't know what you were supposed to do. I had no clue about it. But I was really well trained in structural and strategic family therapy. I was a damn good family therapist. I still am a damn good family therapist. Guess what I did with this family? Family therapy. Why did I do family therapy? It's the only damn thing I knew how to do. You know, when you give a 3-year-old a hammer, guess what? Everything's a nail, right? You teach Saunders one way of doing therapy, cures everything. Cures everything. So I began to see this family in conjoint sessions, and we talked about family dynamics, and we talked about the marriage, and we talked about parent-child stuff. Guess what we never talked about? The sexual abuse. And that family got some fantastic family therapy. And at the end of the day, they could talk to each other, the relationships were great, and we had never talked one day about the sexual abuse. I have no idea what happened to that poor little girl. I think about her a lot because I tell this story a lot. Now, the real challenge is for Saunders to not do that in 2011 when he sees a sexual abuse case. Why? Because we know something now. We have the data. We know what works. So for me to just keep doing what I've always been doing and not take that into account and use it in my practice, in my view, is unethical. And I think from a service delivery standpoint, the same is true for what we do with all of our kids. Damon Runyon has a great quote, you know. The race isn't always won by the swift, nor the contest by the strong, but the smart one really bets that way. And that's what we're talking about, evidence-based practices. Not everybody's going to get better. Not everybody's going to be cured. It's not always going to be perfect. But you know what? Smart men kind of bets that way. And that's where we are in the field. Here's the other reason why we want to talk about this, why we want to use ESTs. Anybody know who Candace Newmaker is? Candace Newmaker was a young girl, 10-year-old in Colorado. Horrible abuse case. I mean, really awful, horrible abuse case. Taken into care, removed from her mother and father, TPR'd. She was adopted by a nurse in Durham, North Carolina. In Durham, North Carolina, this kid, guess what? Had a lot of problems, not surprisingly. She was on that far end of the number of victimizations of that graph that I just showed you. Enormous problems. Mom looked all over the place. Couldn't find anybody to help do something with this poor child. So she was surfing the net one day and she ran across a website that says, does your child have any of these problems? And then they had a long list of problems that virtually every child has at least 5 of. And they said, if your child has any of these problems, they're going to grow up to be a serial murderer. They're going to grow up to be, split personality and grow up to be every bad thing that you could ever be. Call us and we'll help cure your child. This mother was so desperate she called them up. She called up a treatment program that actually turns out to be a very well-known treatment program out in Evergreen, Colorado. And they told her, yes, your child is exactly the type of child that we deal with. Bring her on out here to Colorado. We'll run her through our 6-week program, and by the way, bring $7,000. Which she did. Turned this child over to this family, to this treatment program. She was then treated by these two people, Connell Watkins and Julie Ponder. These are clinical social worker therapists, very well known, trainers in a variety of different types of difficulties. And they began to do what we would now call radical attachment therapy with this child. And one aspect of that was the little girl was covered in blankets and pillows, meant to simulate the womb. Just a little sidebar. Anytime you hear a therapist talk about the womb, run away, run away. She was covered, she was encouraged to push her way out during the April 2000 session. Therapists hoped that she would emerge, quote, reborn, sidebar. If they say reborn and it's not a faith-based organization, run away. Four adults, and as you can see, these are not small women. 4 adults leaned on the pillows. There's actually a videotape of this session that was played in court. 4 adults leaned, adult women, some of them weighing over 230 pounds, leaned on this young 10-year-old, very slightly built child, covered in pillows, yelling at her, screaming at her, berating her, telling her she wasn't fighting hard enough to get out. The kid screamed, I can't breathe, I'm dying, I can't breathe, please get off of me, help, help. The screams got lower and lower and lower. Finally, the screams stopped, and this child was killed by her therapist. Therapist received 17 years in prison as a result. Now, why do I share this story? There's a lot of dramatic stories in our field. You guys hear them all the time. The reason I share this story is because this child is a victim of our system. This child is a victim of our stuck in the mud thinking about what we do programmatically. This child is a victim of people not looking at the research and utilizing evidence-based practice in their work. These therapists, what did they do? They did what they always do. Connell Watkins, the one on the left, in court, as prior to being sentenced to 17 years in prison for killing a child during a therapy session, stated that that therapy had worked many times before and she would use it again if, in fact, a child with that type of problem came to her. Now, what kind of crazy people do we have working in our field? Now, we've got to look at this case and say, there but go, for the grace of God, go on. How is what they did? The outcome was dramatic, a death of a child. But in terms of the way they selected the treatment that they were going to use, what'd they do? Well, we just did what we always do. Why did they select it? Well, it works a lot. How do you know it works? Well, I can see that the kids are getting better. That was their rationale. What's your rationale for why your program works? Is it the same as their rationale? If it is, you could end up on Saunders' presentation. That's not how we select interventions in the 21st century. We don't select interventions because we've always used them, we think they work, and they're really fun to do. They're cool. That's not why we select interventions, programs, and ways to treat seriously disturbed children in the 21st century. They did, and this is where they ended up. So this is another reason, when you think of doing EBTs, and when you think it's hard to do them, you actually have to learn things, you actually have to know things, you actually have to do things the way they're supposed to be done, I want you to think of Candace Newmaker. When you think it's too damn hard to do, I want you to think of her dead. That's the reason we're doing it. We're doing it in memory of her to make her memory live. In my view, if this child's death can encourage us to do what we need to do to deliver the best, most efficacious services we possibly can to kids, we can make her death not be totally in vain. So remember Candace when you think it's too hard. We right now have a very wide gap between knowledge and practice in our field. What we know and what actually is done in the field is not the same. That's true everywhere. We're not alone. It's true in medicine. In medicine, the Institute of Medicine said it takes about 17 years for well-known, well-established medical knowledge to become standard practice in every doctor's office. So we're not alone. Our goal, of course, is to make that gap go down. We want to make that gap go down. So a question is, if they're so great, why don't we use these evidence-based practices all the time? And I'm going to go very quickly through this, but you can look at the handout later on. So we got our top 10 reasons. Top 10 reasons we're not going to use evidence-based practice. Number one, we view therapy primarily as an art, not a science. This is not true. There are artistic qualities to therapy, but it is primarily a science in the 21st century. This is not Sigmund Freud sitting on a couch making up stuff. We have data, we have research, we've used the scientific method, we figured out what things work, we also figured out what things are worthless. Let's do the things that work. Therapists often don't like the idea of actually following a protocol. Can you think of any other profession in which it is perfectly legitimate to do whatever you want to do? If you're a lawyer and you said, you know, I really don't like those laws. I don't like those court procedures. They're really cumbersome. I'm going to use my own. If you're an accountant, you know, those rules of accounting, God, they're so boring. I'm not going to use them. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. If you're a surgeon, you know, the law, you know, the protocol for doing this kidney transplant, it's really complicated. I'm going to do what I always do. No. We have to know things. We have to follow the work that is being done. This is not a bad thing. This is not a bad thing in our field. Research findings don't apply to the real world. Well, it turns out that, you know, this may be true. Researchers talk gibberish. We do a very poor job. Researchers do, in fact, do a poor job of communicating to you, the frontline practitioners, what is going on in the science of our work. However, this is changing. And I do want to share this little comic here. This is a Dilbert comic. It says, I didn't have any accurate numbers, so I just made this one up. Then he says, studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't any more useful than made up ones. How many studies showed that? 28. Some of our political discourse in the country today is taking that approach. What it really boils down to, old habits die hard, even when you have new opportunities in front of you. The way we do things, old habits die hard. A lot of times we're unconvinced that ESTs really work and are more effective than our current approach. Well, data about our current services is really not that encouraging. These are data from John Weiskin. They're somewhat dated, and hopefully they're better now, but he looked at 9 clinic studies of child mental health services, and he did a meta-analysis of this, and he found out that the treatment effect for usual typical services in community mental health services was 0.01. You may not be familiar with that statistic, so let me put it clear for you. It means there's no discernible impact, zero impact over natural recovery. Hopefully you've got better data in your program than this. Stewart and Chambliss reviewed 56 effectiveness studies of using CBT in community settings. Guess what? He found out that you got the same treatment effect in community service settings as you do in RCTs. This means you can, in fact, transfer these interventions and deliver them in our community service agencies, particularly in a sophisticated place like Cleveland. These are my own data from our own intervention that we're doing, our own dissemination project in South Carolina. These are treatment effect coefficients over here. We're actually getting better treatment effects in our community dissemination work than they get in the RCTs. So you can actually not only get the same thing, you can actually improve it. So we can, in fact, implement these particular things in our community service agencies. A lot of folks say, well, gee, yeah, ESTs really don't work with people from racial or ethnic minorities. Let's go to the videotape. My good buddy Stan Huey out at UCLA reviewed a whole series of interventions. Guess what he found out? Generally, they work equally as well with racial and ethnic minorities, and in some cases, they actually work significantly better with racial and ethnic minorities. There really is no data to suggest that evidence-based interventions don't work with racial and ethnic minorities. Reasons we don't want to use ESTs. We're not trained in the principles, and this is a serious issue. Graduate schools are very slowly stepping up to the boat on this. But we have other things that are available. We also have a very poor continuing ed system. What do we do in continuing ed? We do stuff like this, right? Saunders up here blathering away, hopefully being entertaining. Maybe you'll come out of here with 1 or 2 things to think about. That's not how you learn to do new skills. You know, if I was up here explaining a heart transplant to a bunch of surgeons and you think they would be ready to go out and do heart transplant surgery after this talk, probably not. I hope. You know, we need better systems of continuing ed, more widely available, cheaper, more accessible. That's what we've been doing in our work. We have a whole series of online training. If you want to learn TFCBT, you can go for free to our 10-hour training course here, TFCBT Web. Totally free, and guess what? You get free CEUs too, and they're good in Ohio. We also have our automatic consult. You got a question, you're using TFCBT with one of your clients, you got a question, go to TFCBT consult. Punch in your keyword. An answer will pop up. You'll get Judy Cohen or Tony Manarino or Esther Deblinger, the developers of TFCBT, will give you a mini lecture explaining that, and you might, there also might be a clinical demonstration of them doing it with a child. These are the types of continuing ed things that we need in our field to disseminate and push this information out to people like you that actually need it. We have all over the country, we have efforts. This is ours in South Carolina called Project Best. Efforts to disseminate evidence-based interventions throughout the state. I'll be actually in my workshop be talking more about Project Best later. Second reason, there's not much demand for evidence-based interventions by payors and people like that. We're seeing a change in that. We're seeing people trying to change that, but this is a complicated policy intervention. How do we get payors to demand and intervene and request and make sure that you're doing high quality services in what you do? But the number one reason is lack of accountability for our outcomes. If you are not assessing outcomes in your program, you cannot tell whether your program is effective or not. That's the bottom line. And in general, we don't do that. In general, in our field, we assess satisfaction and butts in the seat. How many people showed up, walked through the door, got something? How many people showed up maybe a second time, and did they like what we did? However, we rarely assess actual outcomes. Did they get better? Well, I don't know. If you're not and with that level of accountability, why would we go to the trouble of doing really more complicated interventions? Why would we do that? So until we hold ourselves accountable as a field to assess those outcomes, we're probably not going to get very far in this. We're hearing a lot of rhetoric in our political arena now about science. My own governor the other day said something stupid, which is not unusual for any governor. And then she came back and she said, oh, essentially she said, I didn't know I really needed to check out the facts on that. This is where we are. And this is getting voice over the world. And this is a little cartoon here. What do you want to be when you grow up? A preconceptual scientist. It's the new science of reaching a conclusion before doing the research, then simply dismissing anything contrary to your preconceived notions. And you can see the stunned look. That's got to be the dismissed. We can't let that attitude take over our field. We've got to bring the science to the field. We've got to use what we know, and will, in fact, we be able to develop this community system. I would argue, I'm going to skip over this here, I'm going to argue it's time to dive in. Time to dive into this, time to make it happen. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.